Hey everyone, welcome back to Works 360, where we bring miniatures and dioramas to life one brushstroke at a time. Today I'm diving into something a little personal. I'll be building and painting the 135 scale US gun and mortar team from Tamiya. As a former mortarman, I really enjoyed this box. I'll walk you through the assembly process of priming, base coating, and painting these guys with a focus on historical accuracy, battle worn detail, and stick around because these figures will eventually become part of a larger diorama I'm putting together. Let's jump into it. Here are just a few of the tools that I'll be using for this project. Starting out, the airbrush I'll be using is the Neo from Iwata, which is a great beginner's airbrush, along with the Neo Air compressor. Now, before we get painting, assembly is key. You want to make sure you clip each part off very cleanly, and then also clean up the mold lines that are left behind. Once I have my figures all cleaned up, I'll go ahead and start gluing them together. Now, what I like to do is use the Tamiya thinner, the X20A. I'll pour it directly into my cup so that I don't get any paint clogs. And then I'll use the Vallejo black primer, and I'll mix it in directly in my cup. I like to hit my models with a coat of flat white after the initial black primer. Why? Because it creates a really nice pre-shade effect, almost like a built-in contrast. With black as the base, the deep recesses stay dark, naturally boosting shadows. Then, when I lightly mist on the white from above, it catches the raised areas, giving me an instant highlight guide. This technique, sometimes called Zenithal priming, makes painting a lot easier. It helps colors pop, adds depth right from the start, and keeps everything from looking too flat. In the next few upcoming videos, I will be comparing different painting techniques. For this one, I'll be using the dry brush technique for speed and texture. However, in the next couple upcoming ones, it'll be airbrushing base plus hand painting the details, and then the glazing technique for depth and subtle transitions. For his jacket, I used Tamiya paints olive drab and buff. I mixed them together so that I could lighten up the olive drab just a little bit. From there, I also got some thinner and then thinned it out a little. Then I got my brush and tried to get at least 90% of the paint off. This is very important when it comes to dry brushing. You want to get it out to where it barely shows up on the paper towel or piece of wood you're using. Now, as you look at my paint job, it looks like I probably could have got a little bit more out. It looks like I'm building it up a little too much. It's important to get as much out because you want to slowly build it up over time so you get as much texture as you can. for his pants, I chose US Field Drab, and for his boots, I went with Burnt Umber to start with. As you can see, I recognized I had too much paint on initially, so I had to take some more off. Now, I think the US Field Drab brings out the nice earthly tone that captures the look of standard issue World War II fatigues without looking too flat or washed out. At least that's the goal. I'm trying to apply it in thin, even layers. It's always better to build up slowly so you don't lose the detail in the folds and creases. You'll notice I'm keeping the brushstrokes light, especially over those raised areas where we'll bring in highlights later on. At least trying to. I am going a little fast. Moving on to some of the gear now, I'm picking out the belt, the trenching tool cover, ammo pouch, and canteen using a light coat of khaki. It gives it that classic canvas look you'd expect on standard issue web gear from that era. I'm using a small brush here to stay clean around the edges and avoid messing up the base coat underneath. You don't have to be perfect on the first pass, just get a solid base down, and we'll refine the details later with shading and highlights. I like using khaki because it adds a bit of visual contrast against the field drab uniform, but still feels cohesive. You could also vary the gear tones if you want. Some guys like to add a little green-gray or even weathered canvas tones to break things up and make each figure feel a little bit more individual. I'm switching over to a smaller brush to start dry brushing the boot cuffs. For this, I mixed a little bit of khaki with field drab to give it that worn canvas look. I didn't want it to be too clean or too bright, so this mix gives it a nice, slightly desaturated tone that feels more natural. Now I'm trying to keep the dry brush light, just gently catching the raised folds and edges. It's subtle but helps separate the texture of the cuffs from both the pants and the boots without making it feel like a completely different material. For the boots, I'm laying down a base coat of burnt umber. It's a rich, warm brown that works really well for leather gear. Once it's dry, I'll come back in and add some variation, maybe a lighter brown, dry brush to bring out the texture, and later a bit of dust weathering around the soles to tie it into the diorama. while I'm at it, I figure it's also a good time to go ahead and get the trenching tool handle. I thought I'd come in and try and lighten the jacket up a little bit, give it a little bit of a dirty look to it, bring out more of those edges and highlights. Here's a look at what we've done so far. What do you think? So on to the really fun part, face painting. I'll be using the Vallejo face painting set. It comes with 8 different colors. Out of it, I'll be using the burnt red, brown sand, and basic skin tone for my highlight. Alright, so now I'll be moving on to the face and hands. For this figure, I'm building up the skin tones and layers to get a more natural, lifelike finish. As you know, I'll be starting off with a base coat of burnt red. It might look a bit intense at first, but it gives it a nice warm undertone, especially for soldiers out in the field who would have had some sun exposure, dirt, and weathering on their skin. Once that dries, I'm coming in with my midtone brown sand. I'm applying this more selectively, leaving a bit of that burnt red showing through in the recesses around the eyes, under the chin, and between the fingers. It helps create some natural depth and variation without needing a wash right away. Next up, I'm going to try and hit the high points: cheekbones, nose, knuckles, forehead, with a touch of basic skin tone. I'm being careful here, just dabbing a little bit with the tip of my brush. You really don't need much, just enough to make those features pop. Now, after stepping back and looking at it, I noticed the highlights came off a bit too bright for my taste. It was standing out a little bit too much, so I went back in with my midtone, brown sand, and feathered it over some of those brighter spots just to blend it in a little better and tone things down. It's a small step, but it really helps smooth out the transitions and keep the figure looking more realistic instead of cartoony or overly bright. I then use Prussian blue for the eye color. You want to be very careful in just doing a dot or a line. While working on the face, I ended up getting a little bit of color on the arms. No big deal. It happens. So I took it as a good opportunity to start laying in my highlight layers for the uniform. I mixed up a blend of Tamiya olive drab and buff, just to bring the tone back on the upper arms and start transitioning into my highlights. This not only cleaned up the stray skin tone, but also started to add some nice variation to the jacket. I then continued to lighten the olive drab with a little more buff to bring out more and more of the highlights. I then moved down to the pants and mixed up a new highlight tone using khaki and deck tan. This gives a softer, more faded highlight that works really well on field gear that's seen a bit more use. I brushed it along the tops of the thighs, knees, and edges of the pants where light would naturally hit, and also really bring out the creases. And since I had some of that mix left in my palette, I used it to lightly hit a few spots on the jacket again, just to tie the tones together and push the highlights a little further without overdoing it. It adds that natural sun-faded look and gives the figure more character. Alright, here he is, all finished up for now. I'm really happy with how this figure turned out. The layering, the subtle highlights, and those weathered tones really help bring the character to life. I hope you enjoyed watching this process as much as I enjoyed painting it. If you did, do me a favor, hit that like button and subscribe to the channel so you don't miss out on the next videos in this series. There's a lot more coming, more figures, painting techniques, diorama builds, and tips to help bring your own models to life. Thanks for hanging out with me today, and I'll see you in the next one. Bye for now.